Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking today about the origins of literature and an introduction to literary genres. So right here on this introductory slide, you can see a few things that kind of connect to what we'll be talking about today. So right here, you have an artist's depiction of sort of like a village elder telling a fireside story and everything like that, which is probably one of the oldest forms of literature. Right here in this next section, you see some clay tablets of cuneiform. If I'm not mistaken, the particular clay tablets right there are of the Kesh Temple Hymn, which is one of the two oldest works of literature ever found. Goes back to about 2600 BC. And then this section here is some cave painting, I believe, from the Lascaux cave in France, so like, over 20,000 years ago. So that kind of shows you storytelling of different types. It's been around for a very long time. So we're going to talk about some of these really ancient forms of literature and how they connect to later forms and such. Okay. All right. So what is literature? What do we mean by this term? So some of the things that would fit into this category of literature is stories, poems, history, drama, songs, really just in general, any kind of cultural use of language. So literature does not necessarily have to be written. In fact, we're going to talk about non-written forms of literature, but it does typically include some sort of language and such. So if you can recall, one of the things that was talked about in How to Read Literature Like a Professor early on was this concept of the great conversation, which is this idea that really all world literature is a continual conversation that's been going on for a very long time. So think of it, and I'll just go ahead and read what Mortimer Adler says here. What binds the authors together in an intentional community is the great conversation in which they're engaged. In the works that come later in the sequence of years, we find authors listening to what their predecessors have had to say about this idea or that, this topic or that. They not only hearken to the thought of their predecessors, they also respond to it by commenting on it in a variety of ways. So let's think a little bit about this idea of the literature as a great conversation. So imagine it, kind of as this huge room where people have been talking to each other for a long time. If you want to be part of this conversation, and you're jumping in somewhere, right in the middle of it when it's been going on for a very long time, then one of the things you probably want to do is know a little bit about the earlier parts of the conversation so you can kind of get your bearings in this room and find out where you fit in and what this discussion means to you. And so this is really how this term, the Great Conversation, is very usable and is a good way to look at literature. It's this idea that when you're reading literature, you're listening in on this very ancient conversation that's really about what it means to be human. And so when you're learning ancient literature and more contemporary literature, what you're doing is engaging in this most human of all conversations. And so how long has this conversation been going on? How long has literature been around? Well, I mean, there's no way really to know this, but probably oral literature, that passed down by word of mouth, has been around probably just about as long as language, at least in the sense that we think of it today, has been around. Written literature, as I mentioned, kind of the oldest works that we have are from around 2600 BC. It's a couple pieces written in ancient Sumerian, which is a language spoken in what is southern Iraq today. They're written in what's called cuneiform, which you can kind of see a picture of it right here with this little tablet. They were clay tablets that they would basically press different patterns made by this little stylus into it to make different words and such. And the two oldest pieces that we know of, at least, probably some before that, those are the two first two we found are the Kesh Temple Hymn. We saw a picture of that earlier. And then what's known as the Instructions of Shuruppak. The Kesh Temple Hymn is like a hymn of praise for this temple in the city of Kesh to several gods that were worshipped there. And the Instructions of Shuruppak are kind of a collection of proverbs. You know, it says things like, you know, don't buy a donkey that brays really loud because you'll grow to regret it. Don't steal from your neighbor, he's going to hate you, things like that. So anyway, so that's some of the oldest literature. Those two are the oldest written literature we have. So, but we're going to go ahead and jump back and we're going to talk about oral literature first, because like I said, that's been around for a lot longer than written literature, so far as we can tell. So the oral literature is almost certainly the only form of literature that was around for the vast majority of time humans have been around. And also, even after writing was invented, most people were illiterate. And so while someone might read to them from a book, still probably they were living in what we would call mostly an oral culture, where stories are passed down and lessons are learned just by word of mouth instead of by books and such. So we don't really know when the earliest behaviorally modern humans are. You know, we've got human skeletons that look perfectly human that go back to over 300,000 years ago, if I'm not, well, or close to 300,000 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. I think the earliest one they found was in what's today Morocco. But we don't really know at what point these, you know, skeletons that look like human were able to think and reason and interact and use language like humans. We don't really know when that is. The oldest elements of human artwork which show signs of, you know, symbolic thinking and such go back to around 40,000 BC. But, you know, for all we know, maybe humans were making statues and painting paintings before that for a long time, and that's just the oldest ones that have survived. But even if we say, you know, probably at the latest 40,000 BC for when humans are kind of doing this type of symbolic thinking that we would associate with language, let's just look how that plays out. If 40,000 BC is the earliest behaviorally modern humans who probably had literature and did symbolic thinking and stuff, those paintings we saw earlier from the Lascaux cave in France would be actually closer to the present than that time. Oh, by the way, this little statuette you see here is the Lion Man. That's one of the oldest artworks we've ever found from around 40,000 BC. The invention of agriculture, around 9,000 BC or so, was like, that's 3/4 of the way to present or so. Earliest written literature around 2600 BC. So you see that, you know, humans have been around for a very long time before writing was invented and probably have been passing down stories and such. And like I said, even after writing was invented, it was quite a long time before most people were literate. In fact, the first year that we know of that a majority of people on Earth could read and write was 1970. So yeah, up until that point, at over half of the people on Earth could not read and write. And really, if you go further back, much further back, it's way over half. Even in areas where there was pretty high literacy, we're talking about like maybe 15 to 20% quite often of the population could read and write. Very few places before the last 200-300 years had a majority of people that who could read and write. So, you know, most people, the type of literature they are sharing and passing on is really just passed on by word of mouth, even when written language does exist. So what are some of the characteristics of this oral literature? Well, it tends to be a communal effort. As in, these are stories kind of passed down by a whole community. Now, this might be a community of, say, one village who's passed down a story. It could be a community of, say, a whole tribe or even nation of some sort. which has been passing this story back and forth, probably with a lot of different variations and local forms and such. But a lot of times you'd also have some specialization where you would have some individuals who really specialized in memorizing large amounts of stories from the culture and the community, and then performing and reciting these. Generally speaking, they didn't really value quite the same sort of things that we would today. For example, they weren't so worried about details being accurate in historical retellings. So, they'd be kind of mystified if you said, well, that isn't true. There was, 5 of these rather than 4 of these. They just kind of look at you like, okay, well, that's not really the point. The point of, say, a story that had been retold was that it reinforced the values of the community and sort of glorified those from the past that needed glorifying and shamed those from the past that needed shaming. So quite often these works of literature were very poetic, because poetry is a great way to memorize large chunks of information. Just, if you've learned like jingles for the 50 states or something like that, that's just kind of a modern example of how we use poetic form as a way to help us memorize things. And like I said, there'd be a stable basis of, like here's some important things that any retelling of this story needs to have in it. But the individual teller was quite often allowed some freedom to sort of improvise and embellish the story somewhat to make it more interesting and more exciting of a telling. And that wasn't really considered, dishonesty or, oh, you messed up the story or something like that, as long as you kept the stable basis. And in many ways, since the whole society is kind of remembering this and correcting you if you get something wrong, there were some ways, weirdly, that this kind of passing on of information could actually have some advantages to later writing something down. Because, maybe the person who wrote down that history that we found and we think, oh, wow, this is a great revelation, and we now suddenly know all this stuff about the society, maybe they were the weird fringe person who believed in all kind of the crazy conspiracy theories, and they were just making stuff up. And, unlike an oral telling, which, hey, it's told in front of a bunch of people who are going to shut you down if you start making up crazy stuff. So, it's kind of had a little bit of you could say a fact checker built in, but once again, they weren't real worried about exact historical details on the whole getting retold correctly, as long as the story kind of carried the main important lessons and, like I said, praised and blamed the right people. One interesting thing that scholars who've studied cultures that are pre-literate, in other words, they don't have a written language, is that they tend to have a really great capacity of memory. They can memorize incredibly long chunks of information because, our brain, it tends to say, oh, I don't need to remember all this, so I'm just going to go ahead and shut this down, and we're going to focus the, energy that we're using into something else rather than memorizing all this stuff, because we've got these things called books now. And the brain kind of does that subconsciously. So literate humans tend to not have near the capacity of memory that people who aren't literate do. And I mean, because, if you forget something, then that's lost to your community. At least if everybody forgets it. And say you're the designated memory carrier or one of a small group and y'all don't do your job, then, well, your society just lost that. They can't go look it up in the library again. Oral literature often had different levels of formality too. So you would use, more or less everyday language to maybe tell the story about your hunt yesterday. But then if you were telling some great legend about the ancestors, a lot of times you'd use very formal and quite often kind of an older form of the language, because we tend to associate using older forms of the language with formality. And just look at, like in churches, how many prayers still use these and thous and stuff like that, even though we don't really talk that way. These and thous were not invented to be super formal language. In fact, thee and thou were just the way you would talk to talk to everyday people, like back in the 1500s and before. But today we associate it with high levels of formality and things such as prayers and such, because it's an older form of the language. So some examples of oral literature. I already kind of mentioned one, like the instructions of Shuruppak, the Proverbs. So short kind of little snippets that are memorized and kind of contain pithy truth. These Proverbs are not usually meant to be taken as, oh, always and everywhere do this, because quite often you'll find like sets of Proverbs where you'll find one that kind of pretty much directly contradicts another one. The idea being is that a wise person is someone who knows all the Proverbs and knows when one should be applied and another should be applied, and kind of is able to kind of judge between them. But the Proverbs are sort of these snappy little encapsulations of truth to sort of encode these insights from previous generations. Family or tribal history, you find a lot of so-and-so was the father of so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and on back and everything like that, because quite often these are passed down within these, families or larger families called tribes or clans or something, large extended families. And so it was really important to carry on the traditions of this family grouping and share them with others and such. Ballads are, this is one in particular that was really popular in England. So since we're dealing with English literature, that becomes pretty important later on. So there were songs that would be sung about heroic individuals or sometimes tragic individuals and such, and told a story of some sort in song form, following usually a fairly, somewhat roughly regular poetic meter. In particular, English has a particular meter we call the ballad meter, which we'll talk about later on this year. Riddles. Riddles are often used for training the mind and such to get people to be more clever and such and think around corners and such. And then epics. Most of the oldest epics were composed at least partially of orally passed down information that might have later been assembled into kind of a more complete epic when it was written down, or it could have been passed down more or less intact and written in kind of the form it was already passed down. But these were these lengthy, really highly important stories. We'll talk about them more here a little bit later in this presentation. But they're important verbal or oral literature form in a lot of cultures. So one thing to keep in mind about oral literature is that it was quite often performed. We tend to think of, say, a book or a novel as one thing, a play as something else, a song as something else, and kind of have these sort of somewhat formal boundaries between these. But if you've seen kind of the Beowulf video and all, you see how those boundaries were a lot more fluid a lot of times, where the literature would be recited, and some parts it might be sung, there might be dance and gesture and some acting out of parts, kind of all in one performance. And in fact, the ancient Greeks, Homer was intended to be sung and to a harp and such. And a lot of times these societies would have, I already mentioned this a little bit earlier, but they'd have people who specialize in it, like the bard or the sculpt or the maker. There are different names for them in different societies where, these are people who are performance artists who also had great capacity of memory and would go around singing these, great epics or these local stories and stuff like that. And, a lot of times they'd drop some really, they talk up the local rich guy who would get happy to be talked up, and he'd give him some money. And so just kind of like you'll see product placement in modern day movies and such like that. It was a way for them to make a living by sort of flattering powerful people around. And so these powerful people would keep them around to tell stories that glorified their ancestors and stuff like that. And Sometimes it'd be maybe more of a community effort where everybody's like, oh yeah, let's give the bard a few coins to tell us a story and stuff. So, all right. So eventually, in most of these cultures that we're talking about, there's kind of a transition to written culture, at least the ones that we, are familiar with their literature, because most of the literature we're familiar with eventually did get written down somewhere. This transition to written culture, however, it's not sudden. It's not like once writing's invented, suddenly the entire society changes overnight for the most part. Quite often over generations or even centuries. Writing is very often, it's not seen as, okay, there's its own thing, but it's more of, oh, this will help you remember to recite your verses more carefully. And most, early reading and writing that we have records of seems to have been taken place in front of an audience and be read out loud. So the idea of curling up in the corner with a book, that kind of comes along later on. For one, books were usually huge. I mean, these enormous things that take up like half of a table. So you couldn't really curl up in the corner with this enormous book with, thick pages and probably weighs like 60 pounds. It'd be set up on a stand, and you'd stand up, and you see that a little bit of that going on in this picture here, this medieval scriptorium where they're, reading, or cathedral or something. And so, yeah, reading would still be a communal activity, much like reciting a poem. It's just that, oh, now you have these little squiggles in front of you that help you remember to recite properly. Books were also incredibly expensive up until, the invention of cheap paper and the printing press. Really, even after the invention of the printing press, books were still way more expensive than they are now. It's really not until the 20th century, to a lesser extent the 19th century, but certainly the 20th century, that books actually became relatively cheap. So just to give you an example, before the printing press and before the invention of paper reached Western Europe, it would take the hides of around 40 calves to make a single volume of the Bible. 40 calves. Okay, so all of those hides had to be, of course, skinned, properly tanned, properly cut, stitched together, and then you had to write out and I'm just using the Bible because that was definitely the most copied and common book around then. And then you just had to write it out word by word. So a single volume of the Bible would cost like 4 or 5 years' wages for like a really well-paid craftsman. So if you wonder why everybody didn't have their own personal Bible to tote around back then, that's because nobody could afford it. Okay? You might have one copy in the village church, because it would be like an enormous investment. That's often why they would like decorate it up with gold and everything like that, because these were highly precious and very expensive items. So whether they're Bibles or history, or copies of Homer or something like that, books are incredibly expensive. So even like a real book lover might have just 30 books, and they'd have to be really rich to have that many. And all. So, it really wasn't very feasible for the average person to learn to read and write, just because you couldn't afford books anyway. Okay. And like I said, literacy, 1970 was the first year above 50% literacy worldwide, the first year. So we're not talking like far, far distant past when we're talking about a lot of people who couldn't read and write. There's still a fair amount of people in the world today who can't read and write, but it's much smaller than it has been at any time in the past. So we're going to talk about a couple literary genres now, some of which we'll be touching on in this class. So let's talk about the epic. So epics show up in many different cultures. They typically have a few kind of salient characteristics. The hero or heroes of the epic tend to be larger than life, kind of almost superhuman, doing these great feats. Not necessarily good people. Sometimes they're pretty flawed and bad people, but whatever they're doing on a grand scale, whether it's good or bad. The setting tends to be really vast. It tends to have this huge scope and kind of this idea of almost universal significance. Action is very heroic, huge battles and great speeches and stuff like that. Usually there's some sort of supernatural forces involved in the action. If you've ever read the Iliad, the gods are, they're running around on Olympus and interfering and even showing up and getting themselves stabbed in the belly by the Greek heroes at times, and various things like that. Typically, they would use a very elevated style, so the language would be a little bit more formal and really stately sounding, and go for kind of the very dramatic and sonorous feel overall. And the poet is usually somewhat objective, like they're not really coming in and moralizing and telling you, oh, this is a good or a bad thing. They're just kind of describing to you what's going on. So there's two main characteristics of, two main types of epics. We call them folk epics and art epics. So folk epics are those that, while their final form may have been actually written, I think there's some pretty strong arguments for that the Iliad was actually composed by someone who is literate. They're based on probably poetic chunks and everything that have been passed down orally for a long time. And so they have a strong element of oral tradition and everything like that. And then art epics, on the other hand, typically written by one individual, and they are much more intentionally constructed as a sort of a unified whole they might be from older legends and stuff, but they've definitely been reformed and reshaped by this particular artist. So that's kind of the traditional way of dividing up epics. The dividing line's not always clear. Like I said, I think there's pretty good evidence that Homer, or whoever the original author of the Iliad, Homer or whoever it was, probably was literate, but they were definitely drawing on a lot of pre-literate poetry sections and fragments that they're weaving together into their story. On the other hand, some more explicitly art epics, such as, say, like Dante's Divina Commedia, he's writing the whole thing while using classic stories. He's composing the whole thing pretty much on his own. He's not really pulling in poems from other places and weaving them together and such. So here's some examples of some epics. Some traditional folk epics. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest large written work that we have records of. Like I said, we do have some older pieces that are smaller, but as far as like really lengthy literary works, Epic of Gilgamesh is the first. And it's a great read. You should absolutely read it. It's considerably shorter than some later epics like the Iliad and stuff, but you should definitely read it. The Iliad, as well as its companion piece, the Odyssey, both traditionally written by Homer, are kind of the great Greek epics that pretty much Greek civilization in general, and certainly their literary traditions of the Greco-Roman world, and thus, in many ways, the whole Western literary tradition, including English literature, is really based on, in large part, on those two, along with the Bible. So the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Bible are kind of the big three founding works of Western literature. The Ramayana, which is a lengthy epic poem from India, tells the story of the god or hero Rama, who goes on a long journey and fights demons and all this kind of stuff. And so it's a good read. You should definitely read that. Song of Roland, this is later in the medieval period. It's a story about a knight of King Charlemagne who fights these pagans and basically dies heroically and such. So it's definitely worth a read also. And then Beowulf, which is the oldest major work of literature, of English literature that we have. We have some shorter poems from before Beowulf and such, but as far as longer works of literature, Beowulf is the first. And then some examples of art epics, kind of the quintessential art epic that so many others pulled from was the Aeneid by Virgil. Tells the story of kind of the aftermath of the Trojan War and ties into the founding of Rome. And so he wove together some myths as well as pulled influences from the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he really makes a very original work of literature. So once again, all of these come highly recommended, but yeah, anyway. The Divina Commedia of Dante, that's a picture of Dante there on this slide. The Divina Commedia is in 3 parts. Probably most people have heard of Dante's Inferno. That's the first part, it's about hell. Then the next part is the Purgatorio, which is purgatory, and then the final part is the Paradiso. And through the first 2 parts, Dante is guided by none other than Virgil, the guy who wrote the Aeneid, who was really Dante's personal hero as far as and literary icon, the guy he really modeled a lot after. But since Virgil is a pagan, he, in Dante's way of looking at things, doesn't get to go to heaven, even though he's, in a fairly decent area. He's not like getting tortured or anything like that. He's in the first ring of hell, which is pretty much peace, but they don't get to see God. But anyway, in the last part, Dante is guided by a woman he had been in love with during his life who died. And she guides him through heaven, or Paradiso. And then there's Paradise Lost, which is pretty much the greatest epic poem, at least in contemporary or modern English. It's written by John Milton. It tells the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And comes highly recommended. It's absolutely beautiful poetry. If we had like twice as long to teach this class, we'd absolutely go through it. But Paradise Lost, I've taught little snippets of it from time to time, but I feel like it's really hard to appreciate in snippets. You just kind of have to read the whole thing, and unfortunately, we don't really have time to do that in this class. But if you ever want to read a really great work of English literature, put aside some time and effort to go through it. And I mean, it's not inaccessible. It is definitely advanced reading, but it's not like the hardest book you'll ever read or anything. So, but I highly recommend Paradise Lost. It's great poetry and very, beautifully told. Another form of ancient literature is philosophical dialogues, and I think we're going to read one of those this year. These particular, we get them from a number of different cultures. There's some Indian philosophical dialogues, but probably the best known ones, at least in this part of the world, are the dialogues of Plato. And with very few exceptions, Plato's dialogues, the main characters are Plato's teacher Socrates talking to other people. And so it's kind of this back and forth where Socrates will ask these kind of thought-provoking questions, and his interlocutors will argue with him, disagree with him, try to answer, and Socrates will just kind of keep poking at them until they realize, whoa, maybe we don't know as much as we thought, and then they'll kind of go on this exploration of truth together. So yeah, he wrote them in the voice of his teacher Socrates. Some of them are probably pretty closely based on actual conversations Socrates had, and some are probably more literary creations of Plato, and we're not really sure how much is the case and which is which. So it's called the Socratic problem, like how much of Socrates is a literary creation of his most famous student Plato, and how much of it are we getting like the actual thoughts of the real Socrates. And like I said, he'd teach often by question, suggestion, kind of provoke people into finding out the truth on their own, and leading them to it and such. So he's famous as a teacher as well. Other philosophers also use the dialogue. In fact, you can still find some today. There's a philosopher by the name of Peter Kraft who writes stuff in dialogue form still, and I'm sure there's others as well. But anyway, this is kind of philosophy as literature, and it was a pretty popular form in the ancient world. And some of these, like Plato, one of the reasons that he is still so much read today is not only was he a great thinker and had a lot of really profound things to say, he was actually a really good writer. And at least some of Plato's dialogues make just really great reading from a literary standpoint as well. And that is by no means true of all philosophy. For example, Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, Aristotle was brilliant, and his philosophy, if anything, I think is probably even more profound than Plato's. But Aristotle's not so fun to read because it's not like his writing is bad. It's just, it reads like a bunch of lecture notes. It doesn't read like an interesting dialogue like Plato's. So, you know, Plato is unique because he's not only a great philosopher, he's also a really good writer. All right, so that's kind of wrapping up this presentation. The final slide here is just, you know, an important source that I used through here, which was Harman's Handbook to Literature. You know, if you want to do serious English literary study, this is a book it's kind of a must-have. You really need to obtain that. So because it's what it says, it's a handbook to literature. It talks about all sorts of literary forms and such. All right, well that wraps it up for today. Expect a few questions for this on the quiz, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.